I'd like to welcome you guys to this week's video. As you could probably guess, the amount of rain we had this week has made any report last week's news. So rather than let you know you're probably going to have a tough weekend of fishing ahead, I figured I'd take a little bit of time to talk about halibut, since a lot of guys are fishing for them right now. And those of you that follow my reports know I'm not exactly a halibut type of guy with the way I fish, but that doesn't mean I haven't fished halibut in the past or caught plenty of them. And I'd like to do a SoCal Bight Fishing Academy episode here talking about how to target halibut on a private boat. And rather than going into the techniques, I may cover that later. I think I'd like to talk more importantly about where to find halibut. You know, everybody assumes you go to a sandy area, you know, bounce ball or drift a live sardine or mackerel on the bottom, you catch halibut. The problem is, with the sheer expanse of sandy areas in our local waters compared to the number of halibut, your chances of intercepting one by doing that are pretty slim if you just stop randomly. Also, due to most of the ocean being completely devoid of any life at any given time, a halibut that is sitting out in the middle of the sand somewhere off Huntington Beach in 105 feet of water, say for example, could very likely starve to death before it had a bait fish swim by in feeding range, unless it moves around looking for something to eat. So that's something we have to consider with all fish. They relate to, you know, that any fish that are inshore fish here, anywhere really, but in Southern California, calico bass, sand bass, halibut, white sea bass, all these fish move around looking for areas to feed in. So it's not like they live in one spot or one, you know, just set up shop somewhere and wait for bait to come to them. They actually go looking. So how do you find halibut? You can't mark them on your fish finder, right? They lay on the bottom, flick some sand over their bodies, and wait for something to come along. The thing is, you can make some educated guesses, especially with today's charting software, as to where these fish might be. So let's think like a halibut here for a moment and say, you know, if I was a halibut, where would I go to find fish to eat? You know, sardines or anchovies, smelt, whatever, lizard fish, things like that. Just like any other bait fish, it's going to be somewhere where the thumb is over the hose, and that's causing an eddy in the water that is attracting plankton, which is feeding bait fish. And if you haven't watched my prior videos on this subject, you can probably go back to my first video of the SoCal Bight Fishing Academy series, and it kind of explains the whole thing. But so what happens is, you know, we have current flowing across the through the ocean, across the ocean floor. That current intersects with things, be it a rock, be it a channel edge in a bay or in a dredged out area, be it a piece of an area of shale bottom, and that interrupts the water flow, which creates an eddy because it speeds up that water as the depth changes, and that eddy spins off, and that traps plankton, which bait fish eat. So halibut, like any other fish, pretty much figures out that, hey, the bait fish are going to be in the areas where the structure is. And while halibut don't relate to the structure, they're designed to hide near the structure, flip a little sand over their back, or if it's an area with some cobble and stuff like that, they blend in pretty well with their markings on their back, and wait for bait fish to come over their head. So like with any other fish, you get current, you get structure, you get thumb over the hose, you have the potential to aggregate bait fish, and then the likelihood that there will be a halibut near that spot is pretty high. So first thing we have to think about is the aggregation of bait fish in an area. And I'm going to start shallow. A lot of guys that fish islands, I know Santa Cruz, the Aloha Spirit's been doing it up there, getting really good halibut fishing. I know the private boaters fishing Catalina, getting halibut right up against the beach. The SeaCal sport fishing, the last time the cat was over there, catching halibut tied to the island. You can do the same thing at San Clemente Island. I'm sure you can do it at Santa Rosa, any of the islands, even Coronado Islands you can do it. I know they do it down at Cedros Island. But what you're doing there is you're looking for an area where there are halibut on a sandy beach that are aggregated there to feed or spawn or something like that. But if they're going to be feeding, they're going to be in there for, they're not going to be on every beach, or they might be one or two there. But if you want to find a place where you can catch more than one, you're going to need to find a place where something's happening that's pulling those fish in there. And you know, a lot of guys that fish Catalina especially always talk about that sea bass colored water, halibut colored water in on those sandy beaches, that kind of milky water. That often can indicate some current or surge churning up the mud in there, and the silt in there, and coloring that water, which is kind of what you're looking for. But if you see a lot of that and there's no bait fish around, it's unlikely there's going to be halibut in there. And you know, the idea that a lot of guys have is, hey, I got this sea bass color water or halibut color water. They get in there, they drop their anchor, they drift, and they're like, oh man, it looks great, but I'm not catching anything. Well, that's because, you know, you have one of three components there. You have off-color water. Is there current? Are there bait fish? And if so, if there are those things, you're not going to wait long before you start getting bites. So a good rule of thumb is to look for areas like that. Go and cast a few baits, you know, throw your artificial, whatever you want to do. It's not going to take long to tell you if those fish are in there or not. So don't waste more than 20-30 minutes in any given spot. Something else to look for is, you know, if you're fishing beaches especially, look for areas where they've got some dirty foam on the edges of them. You see it all over Cat, different spots there, and that's, I'm sure the other islands have it as well. I just fish Cat a lot, bass, and I see those areas that most likely would have halibut in there or sea bass. That means that there's a hard rip in there that's creating that foamy stuff that both halibut and sea bass and even calico bass hide in that really dirty water to ambush the bait fish that are getting caught up in that zone when they get in there to feed. So yeah, if you're fishing a beach somewhere, you're going to know pretty quickly if there's biting halibut there. And no matter how good it looks, if it's not, if you're not marking bait, or you're not catching other things, you might be catching a leopard shark, you might be catching sargo right off the bat, things like that. There's feeding activity going on. Give it a couple minutes, maybe you get a halibut. If you're not just catching anything at all, or maybe a 10-inch calico bass, probably not worth sticking around. And that's not just at the islands either. You know, in my very limited halibut fishing since I've been on my own boat, I've done the whole thing at islands and everything else, caught plenty, but the only time I've really caught any number of halibut on my own boat was, I had to look back for a photo. It was back in 2009 when we were first fishing the SoCal. They had a tournament out at Dana Point, and Matt and I went down to Trestles to look for areas to catch calico bass. And we found the beach down there, real shallow water, off-color water, just outside the surf line. Looked just like it does at Cat, but it's just outside where the surfers are. And we had, I think, 4 or 5 halibut, a couple legals. Matt got a real nice one on a spinnerbait. But we didn't really stick it out in there because we weren't really fishing for halibut, and we didn't have a gaff on the boat, so trying to get that bigger halibut into a small landing net was quite a task there. But that just shows you that kind of stuff could happen anywhere. You know, anywhere you have those conditions that line up, you can have a fish come in there. And I think that the reason that those conditions at that beach were there was because there was shale on the outside of that beach. There was hard bottom that these halibut could associate with, and they were outside of the surf line, in between the hard bottom area and the surf, in that off-color water, which is obviously where those bait fish were trapped in there. Those halibut probably weren't originally set up in that shallow water, but they were hanging around that shale area, and then that bait pushed into the beach, so they went in there after it. So yeah, that's one of the scenarios of where you're going to catch halibut. More likely, you know, you have a better chance of targeting them in deeper water. But one of the considerations you have here is, why would a halibut be somewhere, as I mentioned earlier. So I had this halibut here that Corey caught in San Diego Bay. We're down there shooting photos for an article. And that was on a really strong outgoing tide right on the channel edge, the hard bottom associated with the channel in San Diego Bay. Saw bait marks, dropped that slug down, gave it a few pops, caught a nice halibut. I don't know where the halibut specials are running on the sport boats and stuff, but if I was running a halibut special on my skiff up here, I would check out the channel edges where the shipping lanes are that come into the mouth of the breakwall. that creates quite a wall there, and that wall is definitely a significant thumb over the hose if you get some current through there. And then you have sandy bottom right nearby the hard edges, which are going to be holding bait fish, and you can very easily find halibut there. And the trick with that, though, is if you're going to drift, which I would suggest when fishing halibut, you want to make sure that when you drift, you're staying in the zone where the structure is. You're not, if a spot's running this way, you're not drifting across it this way. You want to drift this way. So you may have to look for conditions that are conducive to the way you want to fish, because they're going to be close to that structure. Speaking of that kind of stuff, I remember, God, 30 years ago, they used to, do halibut trips out of Maria del Rey and Redondo. We used to go on a sea spray up at Redondo, and it would seem like you would just randomly go up to the beach up there and outside of the airport and drift for halibut. And you make long drifts and catch them here or there. Some days they get, a bunch of legal, sometimes they get one or two or just a bunch of shorts. Other days nothing, but we always assumed it was just sandy bottom, and we, being me, just a passenger on the boat, out there with my buddies who were running it, we just kind of made long drifts and drug baits along the bottom. You got 40 guys doing it, you're going to catch some halibut. Looking now at the charting software on my Simrad app, I can see that there's not just sand there, it's hard bottom, small rocks, all those different things. So I wonder, going back, how many of those halibut were caught next to a rock or adjacent to hard bottom or directly above it rather than just going through sand. And I remember when we used to stop on spots, we'd look for bait fish and then make a drift. Now, was that bait fish just randomly in the mud, or was it relating to a piece of structure? So if that bait fish is, which we assumed is just out in the mud, there's no way to narrow down your drift. So you start drifting, you drift for an hour, drift for a half an hour, and you catch them or you don't. Now, if you know that that bait fish is associating with structure, now you can really shorten your drift up. So now you might, drift for 10 minutes on one side of the structure, pull back up, drift for 10 minutes on the other, and you've coated it very effectively without wasting a bunch of time. There's stuff like that all over the place, that shale, and down at Dog Beach off Huntington, there's those two inside rigs. We call it Dog Beach because that's where you have your dog on the beach. The two inside rigs in Huntington, that whole area in there off Sunset Cliffs is all shale, and it has methane gas that comes out of there, which creates bubbles areas. And those bubbles areas attract bait fish as well because they trap plankton just like current eddies do. And I spent a lot of years fishing that zone on sport boats, and I'm going to say 3 or 4 of the biggest halibut I've ever seen in my life came out of that particular zone. On the Southern Cal one day, I think I got going to almost 50 pounds right there off Huntington Beach in like 30 feet of water while we were fishing a bubbler zone for sand bass and calicos. So, if you're going to go drifting around and maybe bounce balling around, maybe isolate those areas and pick them apart rather than drifting in a straight line or bounce balling in a straight line for an extended period of time. Regarding depth, I would go wherever the bait is. Sometimes the bait's in 20 feet of water, sometimes the bait's in 80 feet of water. I don't think there's going to be a halibut starving to death in 20 feet of water when there's a ton of bait out in 80 feet, or vice versa. So, use your fish finder, find the bait fish. And you're probably going to want to look for some bait fish a little bit closer to the bottom. If you're in 80 feet of water and you see bait fish 20 feet down, I don't think that's going to get the halibut fired up, but you never know. So, lastly, the islands, deeper water at the islands, that backside east end of Catalina, Santa Rosa Flats. I know there's stuff on the backside of Clemente. I'm sure there's stuff at Santa Cruz and every other island where you're fishing in 60 to 100 plus feet of water, and there's squid nests out there, and you catch sea bass or big halibut. Those halibut are out there because that squid is out there. Those halibut are also out there when the squid's not out there, but rather than being associated with the squid, they're going to be associated with the structure that's out there, off to the sides of it. You can look on the Simrad chart again here. This is the backside of Cat. What you assume is a bunch of sand once you get away from the island is not. It's sand and then areas of hard bottom, small rocks, things like that. So imagine, even a small rock that's maybe 15 feet across, very low relief, barely shows up on your fish monitor. This changes the current slightly. This has some, maybe not kelp, maybe some kind of seagrass growing on it. This traps plankton. This brings bait fish in here. It may hold calico bass sometimes, may not. But a halibut sees this and as a place where it can lay in the sand next to a rock, not compete for food with a calico, for example, which is going to be a lot faster at getting food than a halibut is. So they can lay around those spots and pick off bait fish as they want. And what do you need to have bait fish moving around? Current. So what happens with current is those bait fish are going to line up around that rock and they're going to be pointed into the current and they're going to be looking to feed on that plankton that's getting caught in the eddy created by that. That makes them real easy for a halibut that's laying out the side to just shoot up and grab bait fish like that. So rather than just making a long drift in an area where you've caught halibut or anchor up in a spot where you caught halibut when you were fishing a squid bed earlier in the year, you're better off just looking for areas like that and looking for bait near the bottom and making small concentrated drifts. If you catch so much of small calico and stuff, go with a bigger bait. Halibut have no problem eating a mackerel or a really big sardine. So yeah, there's a lot of dead water out there, as with any species. But if you just stop and think about where you're going, where you want to look, what you're looking for, so basically sandy bottom near structure. And when I say near structure, even 5 feet away from it, 10 feet away from it, something that's going to break the currents, unique current, hopefully a bait fish in the area, and you can pick those things apart. And unlike a sport boat that has 30 guys on there, they got to drop down, they got to get tangled up, somebody catches something, somebody else catches something, guys want to fish 3 or 4 baits, they might catch a halibut, they might not. They got to commit probably half an hour more to a drift, maybe an hour, depending on how they're fishing. And while that works, if you got 30 lines in the water, if it's just you and your buddy, once you get more than 20 feet away from that spot, I'd start 20 feet on one side of it and then 20 feet on the other. And then maybe if it looks good and you didn't catch anything, do another drift or drift on the other side of the spot. But you're going to know pretty quick if there's biting fish there. You're going to get raked or you're going to get a bite or something like that. And if you find a spot that's biting and you catch a fish there or you get some bites there, I'd look around for other spots in the same area that have similar conditions. And just like anything else, you're going to really improve your chance of catching a halibut. But that's about it for this week. We've got some better weekend weather here. I know the SBS is having a tournament. I hope all those guys are safe. If they go to Kathleen, I'm sure it's probably still pretty lumpy out there. And I expect conditions are rolled over a bit. So if you're a tournament guy and you're watching this, don't rely too much on your pre-fish. Don't die on it because it might change a lot. But that's about it. I don't think I'm going to fish this weekend, but I might get out early next week. And if you guys are fishing, I wish you good luck.